Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, let's talk about the new album from Opus 84, I Open My Curtains to See I Am on Mars. Opus 84. It's been a minute since I've talked about this guy. Now, some people may remember that I've already reviewed 3 of his previous albums. I've gone over a lot of his stuff in detail before. I've linked all my previous reviews of him in the description. But if you do need an introduction, first of all, maybe you recognize him as one of the 2 featuring credits on my own Spiral Out of Control album, but he's basically an obscure Bandcamp artist that I met through my YTPs. He primarily makes IDM that, while usually kind of drowning in its influences, is still pretty fun to listen to. Guy's pretty dang good at melodies and atmosphere crafting, and he makes some good stuff. My personal favorite release from the guy to date is probably his last mainline album, Felis Cordata, which struck a good balance between being original enough to attribute to him, but also professional sounding enough with nothing that sounded like unintentional errors, which were my main problems with his Arpaio and Future in the Stars albums, respectively. Wasn't perfect, it was a little on the long side, had some redundant tracks, and the final track on there, Non-Harmful and Operators, way overstayed its welcome. But, whatever. More details in that review. Basically, it was a good album and you should go check it out if you haven't already. Since then, he actually hasn't released that much. He's done some more stuff with Feral Society and this Sound Collage thing, which I didn't listen to as I'm just as averse to harsh noise stuff as I always have been. And a couple of Discord compilations, which I haven't checked out either. Been meaning to at least give Discord 3 a shot, though I've never gotten around to it. I admittedly wasn't really planning on reviewing this when it came out about a month ago on the 2-year anniversary of his debut self-titled EP and Road to Lucid City album. It didn't really look like it was going to be like a major release or anything, but I figured, you know what, I've covered all his other mainline albums. This looks like it's gonna be another mainline album. It can't hurt to cover this one too. Why not? So, I mean, this album was mainly presented as a compilation of both new and old tracks. Looked like kind of a B-sides thing or something, some of which apparently stretched back pretty far in his backlog, and after listening to it, that does appear to be this album's biggest weakness, in that it does kind of feel like a B-sides collection, sort of. The 16 tracks on this thing are pretty scattershot and don't complement each other much. It feels more like a compilation of tracks from a time span of a few years than a regular album, but I went in expecting that, and I got pretty much what I expected. As far as how I felt on all the tracks themselves, I don't know if this is necessarily his strongest selection of tracks, but there wasn't anything here I didn't like either. So to hell with it, let's go down track by track. Alright, to start with, our first track is a reworking of the opener from Felis Cordata, Metabolic Coextension. Certainly a bit more energy here than the original, though I think my reaction to it in general is that, I think I like the original a little better. It's certainly better fleshed out, but, you know, this one's cool too. It's not super far behind the original. Not that the original was one of my huge favorites from Felis Cordata either, but yeah, whatever. Good track there. And we got 2 weirder tracks. We got the Lo-Fi 26 West Coast Elysis, which is like some kind of custom-made vaporwave thing. It is pretty clearly some melody that Opus came up with himself and sent through a filter to make the audio quality not as good. It's interesting, but not a major personal standout. And then after that we got R101 Survival Conquest, which is pretty percussive and intense, though not so abrasive that I can't get into it. In fact, I think in general I've warmed up to some of Opus's more abstract material, like that stuff from the first half of Alpine. Case in point, the next track, KpcF.Opus, which is almost certainly a leftover from that album, given the percussion textures and its ambient synths and just its overall very abstract sound. It's quite similar to his track Nixty Perk from that album as well, but far more interesting and listenable. This was one of the bigger highlights for me, I'd say. Nixty Perk was not as good as I remembered it being. but whatever. Now after that you got Sterilization of Cherry Limeade, which didn't really leave any impression on me. Got a very abstract melody that jumps all over the place and doesn't really have any moment that stuck with me all that well. But then we get Untitled, which I surprisingly did like quite a bit. It's another pretty heavy and atonal track, but it's got this kind of strangely satisfying acoustic texture to it. Feels like maybe it could have been one of the experimental interludes from Square Pusher's Music is Rod One Note. Well, aside from the voice sample in the back half that gives it a bit more of a orb feel, I guess, but whatever. It just creates this uniquely effective, creepy atmosphere that I'll have to give my thumbs up to. That was a good one. And then the Iconolagny Macroscian Dashpot. A much more melodic ambient track. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this was a pretty big highlight for me as well. A lot of satisfying minimalistic harmonies to be found here, like similar if you were to isolate his guest section on my album and not really give it any beat to work against. I think it uses that same synth tone. But yeah, that track was really cool. I liked that one. And after a mostly inconsequential dark ambient repurposing of Katy Perry's Teenage Dream, which sounds like a half-broken air conditioning system from a horror movie, whatever. We then get a nice little selection of tracks that sound like remastered leftovers from Future in the Stars. BB 2002 track is like this nice little low-key, lighthearted thing. Floridafornia sounds like if you were to take California Lights from his debut and fix all of the things that didn't work about it and also make it fit his more well-established recent sound. The melody's more abstract and low-key, but better fits the more laid-back beat. Just a nice little track there. While I've heard plenty of other Opus 84 tracks which sound just like it, yeah, it's neat to have here as well. Palmydia has a much more pronounced melody than most of the tracks on here, just this pleasant little sparkly thing that's some good fun. Though then we get to one of the weirdest tracks on here, Donuts on Arpaio's Lawn, that I don't even know how to even begin describing. It's another very atonal track, aside from some synth chords in the background. The percussion track is very bassy and has stuttering hi-hats and lots of other weird glitchy effects and voice samples, as well as this bridge in the middle which has this synth that sounds like metal scraping or something. And weirdly enough, it turned out to be one of the better tracks on here. I mean, just out of pure uniqueness, I will have to give this one credit. Then there's Trendy Superstitions, the unlisted 13th track on the album, which I thought was actually kind of pretty clever. I like how some buildings skip the 13th floor in their elevators out of superstition. I thought that was a neat little touch there. And this track is mostly another nice melodic track with a toned-down hip-hop beat placed over it and some cool vocoders as well. Admittedly not the most memorable of tracks from here, but like with the other melodic tracks on here, it's some good fun. And then we get Codent, which was another big highlight for me. I just kind of wish it were longer. Like, it's got this hard-hitting techno percussion playing abstract rhythms with expansive synth washes playing in the background. Just another very unique sounding track, almost like a more toned down and abstract take on something from Clark's more recent material. And then there's Ipthel, which I already knew from both his Discord 1 compilation and that EP that he deleted I've mentioned a few times in earlier reviews. At this point, it was a bit disappointing for that to be one of the endpoints of the album, since I've already known it for well over a year. And, you know, it's never been a massive favorite either. But, it's not the real endpoint of the album. The last track is a short little MIDI piano piece called Bliss Slipe, which is cool, though I'm not huge on how the last note is kind of cut off instead of let sustaining. But it feels like that the MIDI was designed to loop continuously, so it cut off at the end of the beat instead of whatever. I guess it could work as like a loop from a game soundtrack, like you put it next to some, like Windows 98 solitaire thing, I don't know. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, this album is pretty all over the place, obviously, but I think what's kind of interesting is that I went into this knowing what I was going to expect and got basically exactly what I thought I would. The reason why that's interesting is that on previous albums, I felt like Opus hadn't really found his identity as an artist yet, and it felt like he was drowning in his influences. Not to say his influences aren't still really obvious. I mean, like, right down to the title here, which looks like a reference to Aphex Twin's Melodies from Mars. But I do feel like between this and Felis Cordata, Opus has at least defined his own musical identity at this point. There is now a sound that I associate with his music, so I'll have to give him credit for that. That was one of my big problems with a lot of his earlier stuff, and it's nice to see him change and grow as an artist like this. And yeah, I do have my issues with this album. Again, it's pretty scattershot. None of the best tracks on here are gonna rise up as my personal favorites from him to date, but even the worst tracks on here still at least have something to enjoy. I mean, the worst one was probably the Katy Perry one, and even that one, that's at least interesting. It's just an album I came out thinking, yeah, that was pretty solid. So I guess I'll leave it at that. If you've been following Opus's previous work so far, you'll probably like this, though I don't know about love it. And if you haven't heard any of his other stuff, well, I guess this is still worth checking out if you like some old school IDM and ambient techno. It's not his best, but it's still worth a shot. I guess I'm overall feeling a, let's go 7.3 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.